We've got a class of around 100 people. So this is very exciting. I'm very excited to get started. So let's go ahead and jump in. It is 6:02. So we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I just want to say thank you all for being a part of this class. This is really amazing. This class sold out in 3 hours of it being posted online. And like I said, we've got about 100 students in here with us. So this is really remarkable that you all want to spend your Monday nights with us. I think it's a great way to kind of shake off some of the anxiety we may be feeling right now. But the art is always a therapeutic gift, and I'm happy to be able to share some sort of art with our patrons as best we can as we're in this transitional period where we cannot meet in person. So we will meet online and we'll have a nice hearty discussion about the play Hamlet. Hamlet was chosen by Chesapeake Shakespeare Company to end our season this year. As of right now, things are up in the air, so we don't know necessarily what's happening with the show, but we are going to offer this class to at least give our patrons a chance to experience the story in some sense the best we can while we are in this quarantine era. So thank you all again for being here. And I just want to start, this is a little bit for me, making sure that I know how to work all the functions, and a little bit for you to get to test out how to work all the functions. So I just want to start with a little question and answer to see what we know about Shakespeare, what we know about the play, and kind of get us all started on the same foot. So let me ask, and you can answer by raising your hand. Oh, look at that. Great. I just pulled up the roster and it's lots and lots of people. Let's see what happens. I will start by asking, who was Shakespeare? What was his profession? Where was he from? What do we know about the man Shakespeare? Okay. I see a raised hand. Emily Hansen, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Well, from everything I've read, we actually know quite a bit about him.
Yeah.
He was born in Stratford-on-Avon, and was born the son of John Shakespeare, who may or may not have been a recusant Catholic. He did attend grammar school through, I don't know, let's say around age like 11, before he had to leave because his father lost his position as an alderman. Then he worked for his father as a glover. And then there, something happened, required him to leave town. And the myth obviously goes that he shot a lord's deer. And then obviously there was that lost period. There's Michael Woods speculates that he actually taught and was a wandering tutor. And then he made his way to London and was an actor and became a playwright and wrote the plays that we love.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we do know that Shakespeare was an actor and a writer and a producer, and a sort of leader of his playmaking troupe. I'm seeing some questions in the chat. We have the question from Howard: was he Catholic? So, a lot of the information we have from that time period is maybe not. We do have a record of a Catholic christening, a baptism of a William Shakespeare, who was born around the time that the playwright would have been born. So we do assume that record to be the record of the playwright William Shakespeare, which means that he had a Catholic sort of baptism and christening, so that would make him Catholic. Now, England at the time was going through several different religious ideologies, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. The major religions were Catholicism and the Protestants. And at some points during Shakespeare's life, Catholicism was the reigning religion in England. At other times, it was the Protestants, depending on who was ruling and what the sort of major feeling of the country was. Shakespeare's writing kind of gives examples of both of those religions. So, you know, he doesn't always take a clear stance on what his own religious background might have been, but we can assume that he was born Catholic and maybe he shifted back and forth throughout his lifetime. Great. Did Shakespeare write / contribute to the King James Bible? You know, I've never heard that. I will say that King James would have been in power during the end of Shakespeare's life. So I don't think so, but you know, anything's possible. And Ron has a comment here. There are tales that he did, and that there are verses that bear a striking similarity to his works. Yeah, so it's possible. Let me ask. So, oops, someone is unmuted. Hello. Okay. Let me ask, so we know that Shakespeare wrote during the Elizabethan time in England, as well as during the beginning of King James' reign right after that. So Shakespeare was thought to be born in 1564, and we believe he died in 1616. So that ran throughout Queen Elizabeth's reign as well as her successor. Hamlet was believed to have been written and first performed in 1600. So this would have been during Queen Elizabeth's reign toward the end of her life. And with that said, I think we will jump in to some Hamlet. Now, I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint presentation. And so I'm going to share my screen with everyone. While we're in the presentation mode, I won't be able to see any sort of chat or if you raise your hand or anything. So I'll just ask that we just push forward through the presentation. If something dynamic pops up that you must say, just go ahead and unmute yourself and say, oh, Gerrad, I have a question. I may have missed something. And we can go ahead and talk about that then. But I won't be able to see you anymore once we move into the PowerPoint screen. So I am going to share my screen with you. We're gonna start. Okay. You are sharing screen. Perfect. All right, awesome. So we're going to start off today giving a little background of Shakespeare's Hamlet, and kind of getting everyone on a good groundwork to begin jumping into reading the play for next week. So for many of you that know me, you might know that I'm a huge fan of wrestling. And I found this funny little image of Mark Henry, who was a professional wrestler and was also one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's strongest men participants. And we've got this fun little photo of Mark Henry holding a skull. It says Mark Henry is Hamlet. I found the photo itself both funny, but also kind of indicative of some of the topics we'll talk about, just about how universal and how long lasting this play has been. There have been several adaptations and interpretations of the play, you know, since it was first performed in 1600. I think we can see examples of it almost anywhere we go. We can hear quotes from the play throughout our lives, and the play has become such a great standard of literary dramatic work, at least in the English-speaking world. For anyone that watches wrestling, you know that the slogan they're going by now is that the WWE is then, now, and forever. And I sort of see that same idea with Shakespeare's Hamlet. It is both so important in the 1600s and maybe even before then. We still see it in today's society, and I think we'll continue to see it moving forward. Just to give a little personal anecdote about Hamlet, I don't know if I should say fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to not have encountered the play at all until much later in life. I didn't study acting or theater early on, and I was actually studying science. And in high school, I tested out of the honors English classes. So, you know, I read Romeo and Juliet in the 9th grade and then never read another Shakespeare play until college. I didn't actually encounter Hamlet until grad school when, you know, I had to read it for some class. It might have been the Shakespeare and performance class I was taking. And I found the play to be long and wordy and very intellectual, and you know, not a favorite thing that I loved reading. And then after reading the play, I saw a few productions of it, and one production that really stood out in my mind was we all went to see a production of Hamlet at the Utah Shakespeare Festival. This would have been in maybe 2012. And in watching the production, there was something so human about the play. Just listening to the language and watching how this character sort of ricocheted from one spectrum of emotion, one side of thinking to another, was so interesting to watch for me. And since then, you know, I still think the play is long and wordy and intellectual, but I think there's method in the madness of that, to quote Polonius. And we'll look at a little bit about what about this length and the way the play is written is so unique that has made it last for all this time. So just giving us a little background of what Shakespeare was writing about. The Denmark of Shakespeare's Hamlet is a lot different than the Denmark that we might perceive today. I think today, Denmark is kind of known as a very peaceful sort of state. And I think if we look at the 19th and 20th centuries, we see a lot of examples of Denmark being invaded by Germany during World War II, or even Austria invading Germany in 1864. And Denmark has always sort of been a victim of imperialism, but not necessarily an aggressor in our contemporary understanding of Denmark. The Denmark of Shakespeare's time was very different. And I'd say up until about 1700, we see a lot of examples of Denmark actually being a strong aggressor and a strong imperial nation. During Shakespeare's time period, we can see that in Copenhagen, which at the time would have been the national capital of Denmark, the Danish king Christian IV ruled over Denmark, and he also took with him several German territories in the south. Norway had been imperialized by Denmark. The south of what we know as Sweden would have been imperialized by Denmark, as well as Iceland and Greenland. So Denmark was kind of a huge imperial power during Shakespeare's time. And I think that is the sense of the Denmark Shakespeare was writing about in Hamlet. The Denmark of Hamlet's time, even older, going back anywhere from about 1000 to 1200 years back, is also an even bloodier and older and more aggressive Denmark. Great. So when we look at sort of the end of Roman rule in the British Isles, towards the end of 410 AD, many of the British Isles were starting to be invaded by Germanic influences. And I'm just pulling up my notes here. Yeah, so areas such as Sweden and England and, what we know as Scotland and Ireland were being invaded by more Germanic influences, and the Romans were sort of being pushed out off to the east. So this area of the British Isles and sort of this western part of Europe was losing their Roman rule and starting to be occupied by other cultures. Denmark specifically kind of came into European history and prominence around 800 AD. So this is about 400 years after the Romans left the British Isles. And Norway served as a home to the Viking raiders. Our first sort of major Viking king would have been Sven the First, who imperialized Norway, as well as having ownership of Denmark, and then just kind of decimated a whole lot of provinces in England and what we now know as Sweden. So that area was just sort of ruled with a lot of rough, tumultuous aggression by Sven the First. And then after his death, his son and heir, Canute, became sort of I wrote surprise, but I think I meant supreme. He became sort of the supreme ruler over all of Northern Europe from about 1014 to 1035. Now, after Canute's rule kind of came to an end, oops, my notes are out of order. Sorry. Yeah, so after Canute's rule sort of came to an end, we see a Danish monk named Saxo Grammaticus who starts to write the history of Danish culture. And he goes back further than Sven the First. A lot of the Danish rule before Sven the First is kind of clouded in mystery and darkness. And Saxo Grammaticus was sort of the first person to put into print what may have been the rules and the leadership and the lineage of leaders before Sven the First. From Saxo Grammaticus's work, we kind of get our first introduction to what might have been the story of Hamlet. In Grammaticus's work, he tells a tale of a prince named Amlethus, and that would be spelled Amlethus. And this Prince Amlethus has a dead father and a usurping uncle. And Amlethus goes on a pilgrimage where he feigns madness to kind of find out the truth between his father's death and his uncle's usurpation of the crown. And he pretends to be mad, and he plots revenge, and then eventually finally achieves it in a very bloody, tumultuous battle. So we believe this story is where our story of Hamlet gets its origin. So this would have been, you know, sometime between the end of the Roman rule in 400 AD and the beginning of Sven the First's rule. So we're looking at somewhere around the 600 to 800 AD where this story kind of takes place originally. Now, we don't know if Saxo Grammaticus's work are actually based on any truth. Some people think that the work is more of a mythical tale of some of the Viking gods. And, you know, there's really no way to prove it, but this is kind of where we get our first idea of Hamlet. Just a fun fact, Queen Elizabeth actually translated Saxo Grammaticus's work, and we believe that Queen Elizabeth's translation is where Shakespeare got his original inspiration for his Hamlet. So this is a little photo that I took out of a book I own called Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare. And Isaac Asimov has a very wonderful companion book where he kind of goes through every major Shakespeare play and gives a critical analysis of the play. So this is taken from his chapter on Hamlet. And I took a picture of this just to kind of give us an idea of the countryside and the area that we're talking about when we're looking at Saxo Grammaticus's Hamlet. So we can see Denmark there in the middle. And there's a little line pointing to Elsinore, which the Vikings would have spelled a little differently as Helsinore. And so this is where we believe that Grammaticus's Hamlet took place. It would have made sense because unlike during Shakespeare's time when Copenhagen was the capital of Denmark, Elsinore would have been the capital during this time in Viking history because it is in the northeast most part of Denmark at a point closest to approaching Sweden. So it would have been a logical place to put a lot of battlements. And, you know, if we're trying to take over Sweden and Norway, it would have made more sense to put the capital of Denmark there as a strategic place for battle against Sweden and Norway, as opposed to having it in Copenhagen. So there's just another reason why we think Shakespeare's Hamlet was during this pre Sven the First medieval time of Danish history. There are, however, some anachronisms in Shakespeare's play, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But I think the biggest one is that the castle that is described as the castle of Elsinore is actually Kronborg Castle, which it would have been a contemporary castle for William Shakespeare. The castle itself was constructed in 1580, which was about 20 years before the play was first performed. So this is a photo that was, I don't know, taken in 2000. And here's another contemporary photo of Kronborg Castle. But it's funny how Shakespeare took this old story and actually threw in some anachronistic elements of it, I think, to make it a little bit more relatable to the audiences that were coming to see it. So going back to this idea of Hamlet being then, now, and forever, Shakespeare was taking this old story and updating it a little bit for the Elizabethans to be able to relate to, because they would have known what Kronborg Castle was, and probably would have related to that being in Elsinore a little bit more than something they had never heard of. Shakespeare does this in many of his plays, and I think it's a strong writing technique to kind of bring elements of contemporary society into a more medieval world. When we look at Henry IV and the Boar's Head Tavern, that actually was a contemporary tavern from Shakespeare's time period, not something that actually would have been around during King Henry IV's rule. So there's an example of how Shakespeare kind of modernizes some of his work to make it relatable to his audiences, making it so transcendent throughout the time and of then, now, and forever. So one I don't know what you want to call him, lecturer that I really enjoy is Dr. Peter Saccio. And he's one of the lecturers of English. He actually used to head the English department at Dartmouth. And he has a couple of lectures on several of Shakespeare's plays. I looked to Dr. Saccio for some information about Hamlet, and he has a lot of insight. He starts this one lecture that I listened to by saying Shakespeare's Hamlet was always old and new, even in 1600, right? So even Dr. Saccio gives leeway to the idea that this play is taken from old guard, but still somehow transcends 600 AD and is made relatable to 1600 AD. And then even further, I believe that lecture I was listening to was recorded in the 90s. Even further, it's still made relatable even to 1997. So what is it about this play that is so transcendent through the time period? Looking at the old story, the play itself, as I said, was first performed at the Globe Theater around 1600. By that time, it was at least 4 centuries old, adapted from Saxo Grammaticus's work, who had written his book in 1200. And then we also start to see several adaptations of the story of Hamlet. Shakespeare was not the first person to adapt the story. The Frenchman Francois de Belleforest wrote a story of this Danish tragedy in his book, The Histories and Tragiques, in 1570. And then there's also a very unpopular Elizabethan play called the Hamlet, which many people believe to be written by Thomas Kyd from the 1580s. This play is now lost to us. It was never put into print, but there's a lot of criticism of it, and it was sneered at by many critics during the late 1500s. Thomas Nash, who would have been a critic of the time, refers to the Hamlet as a slapdash piece of formula work. And Thomas Lodge, another critic, said that the ghost cried so miserably in the theater like an oyster wife. Hamlet revenge. I don't necessarily know what an oyster wife is, but it doesn't sound like a compliment of that actor. So, you know, I think there were many attempts to dramatize this old Danish story that were, you know, unsuccessful or just not highly regarded. So I wonder what it is that Shakespeare did a little differently. Looking at the new story, Shakespeare's story, Shakespeare introduced several new concepts into the creation of this play. One of which being just the basic length and breadth of the play. So Hamlet is one of the longest plays of this time period, it's more than 4,000 lines long, and I think uncut, that would probably be a 4 to 5 hour play. So the Elizabethans were sitting in a theater for 5 hours, which was a longer than usual endeavor for an afternoon at the Globe. It's also one of the largest leading roles that was written at the time. Hamlet himself is one of Shakespeare's largest roles, and it would have been a lot of lines for an actor to learn at the time. The play itself also has a large cast. We see the play start off on the battlements of Elsinore. There are several soldiers. We're introduced to the royal family with Claudius the king, as well as Prince Hamlet, Queen Gertrude, Polonius, who is the king's primary advisor. And then Polonius's family, we have his daughter Ophelia and his son Laertes. We're introduced to several noblemen, Voldemar and Cornelius. We meet Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And then in the middle of the play, this troupe of actors pops up, and we have a huge player ensemble that is added to the play. A little later on, we meet gravediggers and who's the waterfly whose name I can never remember. But several other noblemen are introduced towards the end of the play as well. I think, I haven't tested this theory exactly, but I think if we look at every act of the play, a new character is introduced, which is a little out of the ordinary for a Shakespeare play. Usually we're introduced to the characters in the first 2 acts, and then we don't meet a whole band of players in Act 3 and some more people in Act 4. So the largeness of the cast was something new that Shakespeare was toying with.
Osric.
Thank you. Osric is our waterfly. The facets of Hamlet's character kind of just bounce. As I said earlier, when I was watching that play at the Utah Shakespeare Festival, this actor was just bouncing from an antic disposition, to something very calm and rational, and back again. And I think the way the play, or the way the character shifts and turns on a dime in his emotional capacity was something very new to be writing with and exploring. And then, you know, it's a large play. It's a large scale and a large range of action. Some other things Shakespeare is playing with is sort of this composition of rhythm. I've got a couple of examples here that I think are just brilliant writing by the Bard of Avon. But we see a lot of examples in the play where, you know, the rhythm is moving at a nice, slow and steady pace, and then out of nowhere, it shifts into something chaotic and exciting, and then it moves back into its steady pace. There are a lot of starts and stops in the rhythm of the play. There are a lot of shocks and surprises. There are sharp turns in the discoveries or reversals. If we look at the very beginning of the play, we have we have several soldiers that are out on the battlements of Elsinore, and Horatio, who's a friend of Hamlet, joins them. Now, it's interesting how Shakespeare deals with the ghost, because as we just heard from Thomas Kyd's Hamlet, the ghost was not very well liked in that show, and I think Shakespeare wanted to do something a little bit different, and how the ghost enters the story is a prime example of how the rhythm just shifts. If you give me a minute, I shall find enter ghost. Here we go. So Horatio shows up and he says, you know, what, has this thing appeared again? The soldiers have told Horatio, who is one of Hamlet's friends, that they've been seeing a ghost out on the parapets. And he said, oh, okay, well, let me come out there and look at it with you, because I don't know, you might just be dreaming it. And as they're out there discussing the ghost, Bernardo, one of the soldiers, has this very slow, steady, composed speech. He says, talking about the ghost, last night of all, when yon same star that's westward from the pole had made his course to illume the part of heaven where now it burns, Marcellus and myself, the bell then beating one, and then enter ghost, right? So we see this nice, steady rhythm of text, right? It even sounds like we're about to go into exposition. Bernardo is about to give this nice long speech about the last time they saw the ghost, and it's set up very even kill. If we look at the iambic pentameter, you know, it is very regular. When yon same star that's westward from the pole had made his course to illume that part of heaven where now it burns Marcellus and myself, the bell then beating one, and then enter ghost. And then all of this chaos ensues. Marcellus says, peace, break thee off, look where it comes. Bernardo comes in the same figure like the king that's dead. Marcellus says, thou art a scholar, speak to it, Horatio. Bernardo says, looks it not like the king, mark it, Horatio. You know, and if we're watching a really good production of this, you know, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of fog and lights are flickering, and you just see this image skate across the stage, and the soldiers, these men in iron cloth, are freaking out, right? And then the ghost disappears. And then we go back into that slow, steady, natural tone. So, you know, Shakespeare is playing with rhythm a lot in this play by setting up what seems to be beautiful iambic pentameter, nice, soft, rhythmic exposition, and then it's suddenly interrupted and we're thrown into chaos. I think, you know, we see lots of examples of that. Moving forward in the play, I actually really like this part. Horatio, moving forward in the scene, I mean, Horatio has this wonderful little metaphorical speech where he says, a mote it is to trouble the mind's eye in the most high and palmy state of Rome. Sorry about that. In the most high and palmy state of Rome, a little ere the mightiest Julius fell. The graves stood tenantless and sheathed the dead. The dead did squeak and gibber in the Roman streets as stars with trains of fire and dews of blood, disasters in the sun. And the moist star upon whose influence Neptune's empire stands was sick almost to doomsday with eclipse. You know, so going back to that young Gerrad that was reading this play, this is where I go, oh man, we are getting into a talkie right now, right? It's so much metaphor. It's so much beautiful language. It's so intellectual. And then, you know, we get to the end of this big speech, have heaven and earth together demonstrated unto our climatures and countrymen, but soft, behold, lo, where it comes again, right? And the ghost comes back. And they try to speak to it. It doesn't speak to them. And then they get aggressive. They say, oh, I'll strike it. It's over here. No, it's not over there. It's over here. Oh, where is it? You know, and if we're back to that beautiful production that some genius directed, you know, the lights are flickering and the smoke machine is going wild and lots of craziness has happened. We've been taken from this very slow, sensual, metaphorical speech of Horatio back into chaos with the ghost. And then the ghost is gone once again. And then they talk about how it disappeared on the crowing of the cock, right? So the rooster crows and the sun begins to come up and the ghost disappears. And then they go into this religious philosophical debate about, well, you know, I've heard that demons, you know, they can't be out past a certain time of night. Once the sun begins to come up, right, they have to go back into hiding. But they don't say it as simply as I just said it. Once again, we go back to this nice, slow, steady, rhythmic, metaphorical speech. Marcellus says, it faded on the crowing of the cock. Some say that ever against the season comes when our Savior's birth is celebrated. The bird of dawning singeth all night long. And then they say, no spirit dare stir abroad. The nights are wholesome. Then no planets strike, no fairy takes, nor witch have power to charm. So hallowed and so gracious is the time, right? That's a beautiful, metaphorical, iambic little monologue that sounds very pretty to the ear, but is in stark contrast to the chaos we were just in with the ghost's presence. So, you know, Shakespeare is playing around with rhythm so purposefully, which is a new thing for a writer in Elizabethan England. These sharp turns, I think we see all over the to be or not to be speech is very metaphorical and long and intellectual. All right. And then Ophelia comes in, and we get this get thee to a nunnery scene. We're thrown into chaos. Hamlet says, "Wouldst thou be a breeder of sinners? Get thee to a nunnery. You know, what's the matter with you, woman? Get out of my face." We're thrown into this aggression, and then Hamlet's out of there. And then we go back for Ophelia's speech after the nunnery scene. And we're thrown back into this very soft rhythmical atmosphere. So Shakespeare is playing around a lot with his composition of rhythm. One other thing he's doing is updating the story a little bit. I mentioned the Kronborg Castle, which would have been a contemporary castle, contemporary for Shakespeare's audience, not necessarily for us. But it would not have been around during Grammaticus's work. So he's throwing in a little anachronistic element in there to bring the audience along. Another thing he does is he mentions Wittenberg University, which is very interesting because Wittenberg was founded in 1502. So once again, this would have been a contemporary university for Shakespeare's audience, not something that would have been around during Grammaticus's Hamlet. So, we hear about Wittenberg University because it is where Hamlet has come home from. He was off at university studying, hopefully. And then he came home to mourn his father's death. In the second scene of the play, where we meet Hamlet and the royal family, he wants to go back to Wittenberg, and Claudius, the now king of Denmark, says, it is most retrograde to our desires for you to go back. So he kind of forbids Hamlet to go back to Wittenberg. But it's interesting that Shakespeare chose Wittenberg University because it has a very strong semblance attached to it. I put in this little quote: thou art a scholar, speak to it, Horatio, because Wittenberg would have been seen during Elizabethan times as a very intellectual university, right? It's a place that people went to really study theory and literature and even religion. It was known as the New University of the English Renaissance, founded in 1502 by Frederick the Wise of Saxony. And the university was sort of founded on this idea that it focused on new humanism. It was also a Protestant university. So Wittenberg is kind of famously known as the place where Martin Luther developed what we know as Lutheranism. So Martin Luther, as a teacher at Wittenberg, studied Protestantism and eventually developed his own sort of subset of Protestantism that we know as Lutheranism. And Dr. Faustus, the fictional character, also went to Wittenberg, and he was known as the man who mastered all branches of knowledge. So we see that Shakespeare wants Hamlet to be an intellectual. And he does that by sending Hamlet, by updating Grammaticus's work and sending Hamlet to the most intellectual university that the Elizabethans know of. You know, he's updating the work with sometimes anachronistic elements to kind of serve a new purpose of the story. So Gabriel Harvey, who would have been a, I want to say a scholar at Wittenberg University, talks about Shakespeare, and he talks about Hamlet. And it's interesting because Harvey is kind of known as someone that did not give nice criticisms or critiques of things. He was often very critical and very nasty even of a lot of the things he said. But he sort of veils a compliment to William Shakespeare while also insulting another work of William Shakespeare by saying the younger sort take much delight in Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, but his tragedy of Hamlet hath in it to please the wiser sort. You know, I think for Gabriel Harvey, this is high recommendation because he saw, I think, what that young Gerrad reading the play several years ago saw, and that was that this is a very intellectual play. It's full of puzzles and questions, and it kind of moves through this interrogative mood. I think that's another thing Shakespeare is playing around with that's kind of new to the play. We'll talk about this in just a moment in another couple of slides. But, you know, playmaking a lot of the times did not seek to ask questions as much as it sought to give answers. When we look at morality plays, and a lot of the classic tragedies, and a lot of the Elizabethan work, we look at plays that are kind of trying to send a message to their audience. And we'll talk about like the element of tragedy next week. But even Aristotle believed that one of the high purposes of theater was to give people something to think about, right? Give them something to watch on stage, and then they can go home and make some decisions about their own lives. Hamlet doesn't really give us a whole lot of answers, as much as it makes us ask a whole lot more questions. There are some literal questions that we see in the play. You know, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I? And although that statement itself doesn't end in a question mark, I do think Hamlet is questioning, you know, how is it that these actors can get on stage and cry about Pyrrhus, you know, someone that they've never even met, but I can't mourn properly my own father's death? Hamlet asks that question, and I don't think we ever get an answer to it. Why wouldst thou be a breeder of sinners? Hamlet asks Ophelia in Act 3, Scene 1. You know, Ophelia wants, I think, to make some amends with Hamlet, whom she loves, and I think, you know, who loves her back, or at least did love her at some point. And he sends her off and he says, get thee to a nunnery. Why do you want to make more men? Why do you want to breed and make more of mankind who are just inherently sinners? And then, of course, the overall question of the play, one of the most important questions of the play, to be or not to be, that is the question. So Hamlet, both the character as well as the play, asks us a lot of questions that we don't necessarily get answers to by the end of it. Something I found very interesting personally is I noticed that each act of the play begins with some sort of interrogative mood, some sort of question. If we look at Act 1, we're out in the foggy fields of Elsinore, or on the battlements of the castle, and the soldiers don't know who's around. They know that they've seen this ghost a few nights ago, and I think they're all a little on edge. And the play starts with a question: who's there? And then the other soldier responds, nay, answer me. Long live the king. Bernardo? Aye, he, right? So we start off the play asking, who are these foggy characters? Who are these shadows behind the mist and behind the dust of Elsinore? Who is that? Who is that? Oh, Horatio's with you? Oh, great. And we start in Act 1 asking questions about these figures. Act 2, the act itself doesn't necessarily start with a question, but it does start with a lot of inquiry. At the beginning of Act 2, we have a scene between Polonius, who I mentioned earlier is the king's top advisor, and Polonius has allowed his son to go off to study in France. It's interesting because Claudius in Act 1, Scene 2 asks, do you have your father's permission to go off to college? And Polonius responds, oh, he hath wrung from me my slow consent. I believe that's the quote. So, it kind of sounds like Polonius doesn't really want Laertes to leave, and he had to wring his permission to go off to college. Why that may be, who knows? But then we have this scene in Act 2 where Polonius sends one of the noblemen, Ronaldo, to go make inquiry of his son's behavior. The scene is full of questions. And Polonius says, make inquire of his behavior. Go talk to the tapsters and go talk to the whores and find out if they're acquainted at all with my son, right? And maybe go talk to someone and say, oh yeah, I heard Laertes likes to get drunk and brawl, and see what they say in response to that. Polonius is setting up Ronaldo as a spy of sorts to go ask questions about his son off in France. And then Ronaldo goes, and Ophelia enters, and we're thrown more into questioning. Polonius says, how now, Ophelia? What's the matter? Right? So at this new French scene, at this new entrance of a character, we're once again thrown into questioning. What's going on? Then we move on to Act 3. Act 3 starts with an interrogation of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. King Claudius has brought in two of Hamlet's friends. We believe them to be from Wittenberg, chums from his college days. Although some versions of the play say that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are like boyhood friends. So, you know, some people might say, oh, they grew up together as children, or some might say, oh, they were friends from Wittenberg. But either way, Claudius has brought Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in to try to find out what's wrong with Hamlet. What is this madness that he's showing? What is this grief that he's showing? Why hasn't he gotten over his father's death? Find out what's wrong with my stepson, because, you know, there's a very real stake of Hamlet is next in line for the throne. So we need the new potential king to be up to his duties. So let's, you know, make sure that he's all right, or do we need to find him a psychiatrist? But Act 3 starts with Claudius's interrogation of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and I gave a sample of the text, but I want to read the whole thing. Let's see, Act 3, Scene 1. The king says, "And can you, by no drift of circumstance, get from him why he puts on this confusion, grating so harshly all his days of quiet with turbulent and dangerous lunacy?" So Act 3 starts this interrogation of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Then we move to Act 4, where things have gotten very messy. You know, spoiler alert, but Hamlet ends up killing someone. I won't tell you who, in case you haven't read it yet. But Claudius comes in to talk to Gertrude, Hamlet's mother, and he says, "Where is your son?" Right? You know, things have gone off the handles in this castle. Where is this lunatic? We need to bring him down. We need to pull him back. And then in Act 5, you know, my favorite scene of the play is the scene of the gravediggers, where Ophelia, Polonius's daughter, has died. And many believe that it was through suicide. Probably the grief of Hamlet casting her off, and then her brother is off in college, and then her you know, she loses her father eventually as well. And I think maybe just the grief of all of the things happening to her might have caused her to commit suicide. And at her burial, we have these two gravediggers who kind of contemplate, well, if she committed suicide, then she should not be entitled to a Christian burial. And they contemplate, okay, well, what is suicide? You know, if I'm in a boat and swim or row myself out into a storm and then get taken up by the water, is that suicide? If the water comes to the man, you know, that's one thing. But if the man go to the water, there's another thing. So Act 5 also starts us in this very sort of spiritual and a methodological kind of debate of, well, how do we know if a soul is truly saved after it dies? So there's a lot of deep questioning at the top of each of the acts, which contribute to just sort of this interrogative mood. Who did I put it in quotations because somebody else more brighter than me said it, and I can't remember who now. But someone calls oh, I know exactly who it was. It was The World of Hamlet, written by, his last name is Maynard Mack. Maynard Mack, a sort of a theorist of the, I want to say 80s and 90s of dramatic literature. He refers to the play as being encompassed in this interrogative mood. There's so much questioning. There's so many puzzles. There's so many new ideas sprouting in every act, in every scene, that we don't even necessarily get answers for by the end of the play. But the question is thrown out there and it just kind of hangs in the air. This is a new sort of a technique of writing that Shakespeare is playing with. Many plays did not ask questions as much as they sort of sought to answer them. And then, boo, there's the puzzle of our ghost. I think, you know, the ghost of Hamlet's father is one of the most important and also interesting characters in the play. I think Shakespeare was intentionally trying to do better than Thomas Kidd and some of his predecessors' versions of the ghost. And he needed to create something that was new and novel for Elizabethan audiences. What's puzzling about Shakespeare's ghost is that we're not really sure if it's a ghost or if it's a figment of Hamlet's imagination. Well, I guess we know that there is something out. We know that there is something out on the battlements because the soldiers see it, Horatio sees it, but Hamlet is the only one that speaks to it. So it is what he hears, you know, the truth of a ghost talking to him? Is what he hears just some sort of manipulative manifestation of his own mind because he's so grieved about his father and he's so upset that his mother has now married his uncle? Does he just sort of manifest this stuff out of his own grief? Is the ghost a demon, actually? We kind of see several different manifestations of this ghost in Shakespeare's play. He presents it in some senses as a Catholic ghost. Now, the Catholics believed in purgatory, and it was said that a ghost came from purgatory through a divine permission from some sort of higher power to sort of enlist the help of men to help them find rest. If you look at Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, Jacob Marley comes from purgatory to enlist Scrooge to not only save his own soul, but possibly save the souls of many others, like Tiny Tim. And it was thought that maybe these ghosts came to the earthly world because they needed to do some sort of good deed to leave purgatory, or to fail at the good deed and then go to hell. So that would have been a Catholic interpretation of a ghost. And Shakespeare kind of talks about that. The ghost himself, when he's talking to Hamlet at the beginning of the play, talks about the afterlife, and he describes what many Catholics would have seen as a purgatory that he's stuck in until he can find rest and move on to the other side. There's also evidence of a Protestant ghost in the play. Protestants did not believe in purgatory. They either say, you know, you die and you're either going to heaven or to hell. And they thought that although angels may come down from heaven to help save people, most ghostly sightings were demons from hell that were trying to damn your soul into doing something bad so that, you know, they'd have another tick mark for the devil. There's also evidence of the play of this ghost might be a demon, and Hamlet talks about it. You know, what if this ghost I saw is just a demon trying to make me kill my innocent uncle and thus damning my soul to hell, you know? So that's why he has to move throughout the play to get proof of Claudius's betrayal and usurpation of the throne, because he's not sure that the ghost can be trusted. And then, you know, there's also evidence that maybe the ghost, or at least the voice of the ghost, is just a figment of Hamlet's imagination. In a later scene in the play where Hamlet is arguing and berating his mother, the ghost comes back in her bedchamber and says, you know, be nice to your mother. You know, she's only human. Her flesh is weak. And Hamlet starts talking to the ghost, but his mother cannot see the ghost. Unlike Bernardo and Marcellus and Horatio, who saw the ghost earlier in the play, for some reason, Gertrude does not see the ghost. And so now we wonder, oh, is this just a figment and a manifestation in Hamlet's mind and not actually something that appears at all? So the puzzle of what the ghost is a great way of Shakespeare taking a new form of sort of the elements of the ghost that may not have been very successful in other adaptations of this play. Now, next week we'll talk about tragedy, and we'll look at it from a sort of Aristotelian sense, as well as an Elizabethan idea of what tragedy might have been, or at least you know, the drama of tragedy. But plays and playmaking was sort of meant, and Shakespeare says it, the purpose of playing is to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature, right? So we see that mirror. Maybe it's a distorted mirror, maybe it's a cracked mirror, but we see a reflection of nature on stage. And from that reflection, we begin to learn things about ourselves, about our society, about our existential existence. And hopefully, you know, we're able to make some conclusions about those things. Hamlet is a very unique tragedy in that nothing gets firmly concluded. If we look at some of Shakespeare's other tragedies, Romeo and Juliet, you know, I think we're given a very clear message in that play, and the friar says it. He says, love moderately. That play is about moderation. We see these two young protagonists in the play acting very wildly, you know, falling in love one hour, and then out of love the next hour, and then falling in love again with somebody different the third hour, right? So that there is nothing moderate about Romeo and Juliet. And I think, you know, when we look at that play, we empathize a bit with the friar who says, love moderately, long love doth so. Too swift arrives as tardy as too slow, right? So don't be so swift. Don't be so eager to take to make things happen. What happens if maybe you just sit back and take a breath? Othello, you know, I think the lesson in Othello is very obvious to many of us, but I just love to quote Iago, who says, "Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. That cuckold lives in bliss, who, certain of his fate, loves not his wronger, but oh, what damned minute tells he o'er, who dotes, yet doubts, suspects, yet soundly loves. Poor and content is rich, and rich enough, but riches fineless is as poor as winter to him that ever fears he shall be poor. Good heaven, the souls of all my tribe defend from jealousy," right? And I think that's what the play is about, right? Shakespeare is writing to his audience, beware of jealousy. Some people like to think that Hamlet is about inaction and how not jumping on the train and being inactive, being idle, can get us into trouble. Hamlet is faced with a couple of foils in the play. Foils kind of being mirror images of what could happen if his disposition were different. One foil we meet is Fortinbras, who is the young sort of ruler of Norway now, who has hit Fortinbras's father has also died, and Fortinbras kind of takes the throne and charges forward with it. Why couldn't that be Hamlet? Because of his idleness, perchance. We also see the foil of Laertes, right? Laertes' father dies, and he comes all the way back from France to demand a retribution of his father's death. Whereas we see Hamlet, who's been given clues by the ghost. He's come up with this plan, this plot to find the truth. And by now in the play, he has discovered the truth, and yet he still has not gotten revenge for his father's death. I don't know necessarily if I buy inaction as being the sort of the dramatic drive of the play, because I think Hamlet actually stays very active throughout the play. He comes up with this plan for the players in the mousetrap, and then he goes to see his mother. That ends in some tragedy. He gets sent away on a ship, and then comes up with another plan to get off the ship, come back to Denmark, and revenge his father's death as he needs to do. So, you know, I think Hamlet stays very active through the play. He just has to be certain that the ghost is not a demon, or that the ghost is not a manifestation of his mind. And once he does get that certainty, actually the play kind of spirals to an end. So what is the the dramatic significance of this play. What do we learn from it? Does it answer any questions, or does it just kind of send us to ask more questions about ourselves? I don't know. And once we read through the play, we can talk about that a little bit more. But I do think Shakespeare is playing with a new style of writing that's a little different from his other tragedies and a little different from other Elizabethan drama. Not so much trying to answer a question as much as it's trying to ask one. And that's my little presentation. Let me stop sharing my screen. Okay. All right. Well, that was a mouthful. I guess now I want to just open up the floor to discussion, questions, comments, things that may have stuck out or things that you might want more clarity on.
Great talk.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, if you would like to share anything, you can raise your hand and I should be able to do whatever. Go ahead.
Hi, I was a little late today. I was wondering if you're going to be doing readings from the play.
Yeah. Actually, I have that on my agenda to talk about towards the end of this class. So we'll get back to that question. Thank you. Anything else? Yes, Margaret Mullins. Sorry, let me unmute you 1 second. I have to find you. There you are. Unmute.
Yes, I have a question about rhythm.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was this a new concept among writers, or did Shakespeare introduce this for any particular reason, maybe to get more attention, to sell more tickets, or was it an established technique to start and stop and break things up and interrupt and this whole concept of rhythm?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so it was not a widely accepted or widely used form of dramatic writing at the time. You know, Shakespeare does a lot of novel things with rhythm. Iambic pentameter in itself was not the most popular form of poetic writing at the time, and Shakespeare was kind of a trailblazer when it comes to iambic pentameter. That's that verse meter that goes da dum da dum da dum da dum da dum. Many writers of the time were writing in iambic quatrameter, which we might recognize from Dr. Seuss, who says, "I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am." And a lot of writers were writing in that style. So Shakespeare was kind of taking the reins as a iambic pentameter writer when it comes to rhythm in that sense. I also think this idea of the starts and stops, the sort of slow smoothness, going into chaos and then coming back, I think was also a novel, a literary device that Shakespeare was using. Now, that's not to say other writers didn't do it. We might see smaller examples in it. You know, I think there might be examples in it in some of the more supernatural stuff that was out at the time. If we look at Dr. Faustus, you know, there might be examples of that in there. But I think Shakespeare, along with being a writer and an actor and a theater manager, he was also an audience member. And I think he would go to see plays and see something that worked very well and said, oh, you know what, I like that they did that in Act 1, Scene 3. I wonder what would happen if I made a whole play that had that element in it. Shakespeare was not the first person to write an iambic pentameter. And I think, honestly, he went to see, a play that was written in iambic pentameter and said, oh, you know what, I like that more than this quatrameter, so I'm going to start writing in that. I think this idea of the start and stops is something he was inspired by in some Elizabethan show that he saw.
Yeah, Christopher Marlowe. Zoe Landau says Christopher Marlowe invented iambic pentameter.
Thank you. Martin, yep.
Yeah.
Go
Hi.
ahead.
So, in some ways, the society in the show is like 1600s England. In some ways, it's like 1600s Denmark. In some ways, it's like medieval Denmark. And that's just a really messy contradiction. If you try to make it like any one of those three, it's doing kind of a disservice to the whole. But if you try to make it like the whole, it doesn't resemble any like real kingdom that's ever really existed. So when you're putting on a show and you make all these decisions about how everyone's going to be dressed or what swords everyone's going to use or how much we really expect them to believe in the family and religious taboos that the show hinges on, do you come at it with any sort of system, or is it just picking the influences that make the show that you'd want to watch?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Martin. I think any theater maker will pick the elements of the show that they most want to focus on. I have a lovely quote here. So this is by Maynard Mack, who he would have been an English professor at Yale at some point. And something he says, which I think applies to the staging of all of these classical dramatic works. He says that no one is likely to accept another man's reading of Hamlet. Anyone that tries to throw light on one part of the play usually throws the rest into deeper shadow. And I find that very interesting because I do think, we attach ourselves to the elements that we're connected to based on who we are, where we're from, what sort of socioeconomic class standing we have, our race, our religion. We attach ourselves to the part of the play that most resonate with us. One of the strong things about Shakespeare is that I think he was able to throw elements into his plays that resonated with large groups of people. So regardless of where you might be from, your background, your future, there's something for you in every play. There's something for you in Hamlet. And I think, you know, yeah, taking elements of 1600 England and elements of 1600 Denmark and medieval Denmark. And if you're watching, you know, I know that our production is supposed to be set in sort of the turn of the century, early 1900s America. So I think an audience member could go to this show and see elements of the medieval that they attach to, or see elements of the Elizabethan that they attach to, or see elements of 1900 America that they attach to, or even, you know, see elements of contemporary America, because although a play may be set in ancient Athens, we're still doing it in 2020 Baltimore. So just out of, you know, necessity, there will be elements of, oh, you know what, that person sounds like my grandmother. So that's what I attach to. And that is the contemporary 2020 Baltimore aspect of the play, which no one really might have even planned that we attach ourselves to. So yeah, it can be problematic, but I think it also can open up an audience to a large scope of themes and ideas and motifs to relate to. Anything else? Emily, and I'm not getting your last name, it just says Hands.
Hanson.
Okay, thank you.
That's okay. Yeah, but sometimes it does like a weird cutoff thing.
Yeah.
I read somewhere, and I'm not I can't remember where for right now, but what do you think of the idea of Hamlet and Othello being the heroes in the wrong plays? That if, because you talked about Hamlet actually not being in it as inactive as we think, but searching for certainty before he does act, versus Othello kind of acting before he really does have any certainty, and maybe they're heroes in the wrong plays. And that if Othello had, you know, had been in Hamlet's shoes and acted more precipitously, you know, things would have gone better in Hamlet. And if Othello had some of Hamlet's search for certainty before, you know, being overwhelmed by his jealousy, things would have gone differently there.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory, and I have a thought about it. But would anyone else like to share their thoughts about that? Howard Berkowitz, I am going to unmute you. Howard, could you unmute yourself? Okay. Yeah.
If Othello had been in Hamlet, the play wouldn't have gone past Act 2. As soon as he heard the ghost say, "Your uncle did it," he would have gone out and killed the guy. So, you know, it's like, it's not like you get a play. You know, and the same thing, I guess, with Hamlet. If Hamlet were in Othello's place, Iago could certainly not do what he needed to do. Hamlet would simply not accept that easily. So in some sense, it's funny that if Othello had been in Hamlet's play, there wouldn't have been a play. It would have ended in Act 2, Scene 2 or something, you know, like that. So it's just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Jonna Leary, can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Sure, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think on the topic of theories about the popular theory that Ophelia may have been pregnant that adds another layer to the nunnery speech and the whole scene.
Yeah, I guess, you know, whenever I hear these theories, my only question is there any textual evidence to support it? I'm not sure that I necessarily find any evidence in the text directly that says that she was pregnant. Does anyone else? Yeah, Aaron Gresh.
Hi. Yeah. So I'm not sure about the pregnancy. I like the idea behind it, but last year when I was teaching it to my students, they found textual evidence because we do that in English class, but they were stuck on the idea that Gertrude murdered Ophelia based on the accounts of her watching Ophelia slowly go into the water and sink in, and here she would be with all of her attendants on a walk and no one's rushing in to grab Ophelia. So it would put a little bit of a twist to it, because Kenneth Branagh really did play his Hamlet as Ophelia's lover, which would have been, which would have thrown Ophelia into pregnancy because, no birth control back then. But I think there'd be an interesting twist, but that would have to be definitely coming from a director's point of view.
Yeah, and I think the fun thing about acting sometimes is you can kind of have a secret as your character. I've got a secret that only I, the actor, know about, and maybe there's some cheese down that hole to kind of play with as an actor. But I also think there's textual evidence in the negative of that, because there's a scene with Claudius and Gertrude and Polonius where Claudius is asking Polonius, well, what has your daughter been doing with Hamlet? And Polonius says, well, what do you think of me? I raised a good girl. She would never try to go above her station by trying to be with Hamlet. So that might be true. I think there's just as much possibility for one over the other. Laura, there's no last name, but you can unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. I was going to bring up, there's this continuous thing in a lot of Shakespeare's plays, and also just in the mindset of Catholicism at the time, where if you're able to swim and you're not drowning, you could be a witch, which I know we don't always really associate the idea of witchcraft and witch hunts with Shakespearean times. But when you consider that the last woman to be burned or executed as a witch was in something like in England, in the UK, was in something like 1750 something, I think it was. I mean, that could be another reason. I mean, we have to really assume that, the reason why nobody's going in to get her is it's a bunch of women. They don't know how to swim.
Nice, thank you. Aaron Gresh.
I didn't raise my hand, but sure.
It's telling me you did. Sorry.
She would have attendants. The attendants may be female, but she would have guards as well. The queen would never go anywhere without her guards. But there is evidence of big witch hunts going on in England at this time when Shakespeare was alive, during Elizabeth's reign as well, especially up in the Scottish borders and things like that.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I think that any of these theories are likely, and they give the actor, the director, the designer choices that they can make. I think it just comes down to, for me personally, is it supported by the text that I'm living through, and if I can make an argument to yes, then I'm all for it. Other things. Sorry. Yes. Sorry, I just am looking at the chat, and there's some talk about if there's any textual evidence of Ophelia's pregnancy. I just want to read some of the stuff we have here because I think it's interesting. Ron Hennigan says, no, but there could be. There's nothing that says she's not. And yeah, I agree with that. Howard says, the idea that Gertrude killed Ophelia leads to a radical view of Gertrude, perhaps her knowing of the murder of Hamlet Sr., for one. And I think that's a good thing to bring up, right? Why would she kill Ophelia? I think it might make her into a villain that we may not have intended. Raina May says the pregnancy theory is the same as the Oedipal theory. I guess I would have to see it in the text to think it was worth exploring. And Zoe Landau says there's a, don't go away. There's a book, which I haven't read, but it's on my list, called Gertrude and Claudius by John Updike, that paints them as having been lovers for much longer. Yeah, I have read that, and it's an interesting read.
Yeah, it's actually, Gerrad, it's also been put into a play that we were supposed to read last year. Yeah, it talks. Yeah, it's interesting. Those of you that like Updike, and like Shakespeare, it's a fun little cross between the two. But it basically looks at, while Hamlet Sr. was out, conquesting, that Gertrude was at home and with his brother, and so they started their relationship, while he was away, literally. Sorry to break in there.
No, that's great. I have a note here from, I can't, it's so small. Sumnera Handy, who says, I think a pregnancy works, though as further motivation for her suicide. Rue was an abortive herb, and Ophelia tells Gertrude, you may wear your rue with difference, as in wearing sadness generally versus, as in wearing sadness generally versus rue as an abortive. And Hamlet tells Polonius rather suggestively to make sure that Ophelia doesn't walk in the sun as his daughter may conceive. There are also many allusions to pregnancy and conception in other places. Yes, good point. Any other comments, questions, opinions that we would like to discuss?
Gerrad, I'm just going to break in here and just say you got 15 minutes left. In anticipation of next week, there might be some questions that you want to pose to the group. I would say at some point, the people that are still on the call, if you're going to be studying Hamlet as part of school, or one of your colleagues is studying it as part of a class, let us know, just in case there's a way that we can connect with your students. I would just put that out there. Thanks, man.
Thank you. So looking forward to next week, we're going to be talking a little bit about Aristotelian theory of tragedy as well as Elizabethan theory of tragedy, some similarities between the two, and kind of how Shakespeare's Hamlet might fit into either or both viewpoints. Everyone, for your homework this week, please read the first half of Hamlet. And so I would like you to read through Act 3, Scene 1. So you'll read up to Hamlet's advice to the players, which starts, "Speak the speech, I pray you," yada, yada, yada. So read up until that point. And in the email I sent everyone, there's a link to the Folgers website. And the Folger has a PDF version of the play that you can read, and that'll be what I and all of the other teachers will be using as a reference as we move through the class. So, you know, if you have your own version of Hamlet, that's fine. I also have like a No Fear Shakespeare version and a Riverside edition, so I'll be using all of my versions. But do read the Folger edition if you can. You can download it onto your computer. You can also print it out if you'd like to have a hard copy, but that is available to everyone. I just want to kind of ask if, well, maybe not ask, but just talk about, if no one has ever read a play before, this might be a wonderful jump start into my first time ever reading a play. I teach lots of non major actors in college, and a lot of them have never read a play before. So we have to have a conversation sometimes about what are some best practices to kind of really delve into the play. I would recommend reading the play out loud. It's very helpful to both get the oral as well as the linguistic sense of what's happening. Shakespeare is actually a genius at making things sound and feel like what they are. When characters are in immense distress, you can feel it on your tongue of the language. You can hear it in kind of the consonants and the sort of drive of the language. So do read it out loud, because I think it helps kind of follow the story and the atmosphere and the mood of the play. I've also found it helpful, if you like, you can read the play while listening to it. There are several, what do I want to say, like book on tape versions on YouTube. So you can pull up, you can pull up a kind of someone reading through the text. And a lot of the time, you know, they'll have actors, you know, and a couple of different actors reading characters in the play. So you can listen to it as you're reading it. And I found that helpful as well. There are lots of resources on YouTube if you'd like to do that. I would also recommend, you know, read it standing or walking around. Sometime the wonderful thing about Shakespeare is that his plays were never really meant to be read and studied in a class like we're doing right now. You know, it's great that we have this, but these plays were meant to be seen. They were meant to be performed. They were meant to be heard. People during Shakespeare's time, Elizabethans, would say, "Oh, I'm going to the Globe to listen to a play." So the oral significance of a lot of these plays is even more powerful than just sitting at a desk reading it. If you can get up on your feet and say the words out loud and walk around your apartment it'll be a great way to kind of get some exercise in while we're all trapped in our homes. But also just get your body moving with the text. I find that to be very helpful. And you can approach it as a performer would. You know, like I said, these plays were meant to be performed, and there is a performative aspect that we can get out of it as opposed to just reading it at a desk. So those would be kind of my initial instructions for getting through the first, you know, 3 acts and 1 scene of the play. Ron, do you have any?
I don't. I think it's a couple people suggested making sure that you try to read something in 1 full sitting. It doesn't matter to me what you read, as long as, like as Gerrad, you said, as long as you read it out loud. And I think that if you I always had trouble when I started to read Shakespeare plays with keeping all the characters straight. And so one thing I did is I made a copy of the list of characters that happens in the front page. And what I would do is I would cast it with people that I knew from like Hollywood movies, just as sort of placeholders until I got a sense of who they were. And so I think at the time, you know, it was the late 80s. So I was like, oh, okay, you know, that would be played by Richard Gere, or that would be played by, so I'm showing my age there. But helping sort of cast the play, then you can sort of hear the music that the character is speaking, because now you have a voice to associate it with. So use a little imagination with it. I would suggest that as well. Thanks, G.
Yeah. You know, I'll also say that, as I said in the beginning, the play is a little wordy. It's a little intellectual. It is shrouded in the interrogative mood, as we talked about. So don't feel the need to finish it all in 1 sitting. Sometimes it's better to eat the sandwich 1 bite at a time than to shove it down your mouth. So if all you can get through tonight is Act 1, Scene 1, then that's perfect. And then try to get through Scene 2 and maybe Scene 3 tomorrow. Take it 1 bite at a time, because it is a lot of words. It's a lot of text. The last thing I want to ask is, we will ask for some readers to kind of read sections of the play as we go through in the class. I think that I'll definitely want a couple of readers next week. I know that Ron will want some readers when he comes to the big speeches later on in the class. If you are interested in reading anything, could you please send an email, and I'm going to put this in the chat.
Yeah, they're putting it all over the chat, Gerrad, just so you know. A bunch of people are volunteering in the chat room.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Great. So you can put it in the chat right now, or if you want to think about it, you can email me, and I'm putting my email address in the chat. Shakespeare.com. Wait, did that work? Oh no, I sent it to Howard. Sorry, Howard. Let me try again. Taylor at Chesapeake Shakespeare.com. Okay, I hope that I spelled it correctly. But yeah, if you want to think about it and get back to me later, you can shoot me an email, or if you put it in the chat right now, that's perfect. Thank you. We're at 7:56. So if anyone has any last minute requests or angst, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I forgot the first day in Shakespeare. Yeah, I did. Well, thank you. Thank you, Laura. I think this was a good session. Is someone talking?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just laughing because Susan's an editor, so she caught it.
Great. Thank you, Susan. I will see everyone next week, and we'll pick up with the first half of the play. And thanks again, everyone, for being here. I hope this was fun. I hope you learned something. I hope you got something out of it. If you have any things that you want to share with me, you can shoot me an email. You can say, "Oh, Gerrad, you were terrible," and then I'll go find someone else to teach for next week. But if not, then or you can say, "Oh, Gerrad, I thought you were lovely. Please come back again." But feel free to shoot me any comments that you might have about the class, especially if you were having any technical difficulties, because maybe we can help fix that. And I will see everybody next week. Have a good week away. Bye.